Welcome back everyone to Formula 1 2020 and to your race review here at Turkey for the Formula 1 2020 Turkish Grand Prix. Round 14 of the season, a day to remember in Formula 1 history for more reasons than one, and I tell you now, just like yesterday, if you've not seen the race, I generally believe, and I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section below, I think that was the race of the season. More on that later on, but as always, if you are new, feel free to subscribe. Spoiler warning ahead, but because there is so much to talk about, I want to jump straight in with today's results. Spoiler warning out of the way, here is your result for the 2020 Turkish Grand Prix. And for the 94th time in his Formula 1 career, from 6th on the grid, claiming his record equaling 7th world title, Lewis Hamilton is your race winner and kind of new world champion. Your 2020 world champion. That doesn't really paint the picture of the Grand Prix, but what just adds a little bit of spice to the initial results is Sergio Perez for Racing Point, equaling his best ever Formula 1 result, his best result since Italy 2012, racing for Sauber. He's in P2 for Racing Point. Sebastian Vettel for Ferrari, P3, starting 11th. Again, it just really doesn't paint the picture. I cannot wait to get into our race rundown in a moment. And to make things just that little bit sweeter for all you Ferrari fans, Charles Leclerc, P4. A great drive from the two McLaren drivers, Carlos Sainz P5, Lando Norris P8, but a somewhat disappointing drive for the two Red Bull drivers that split the McLarens in 6th and 7th. Verstappen just edging out Alex Albon this race weekend. Our pole man, Lance Stroll, what a day it was yesterday. Today, things fell apart in the halfway stage of the Grand Prix. A dodgy strategy call from Racing Point set Stroll down to P9. What could have been for Lance today? Daniel Ricciardo was P10, rounding out the points. His teammate Esteban Ocon was P11, had a great comeback drive but couldn't quite pick up points today. Danny Kvyat led the two AlphaTauris in 12th and 13th. Valtteri Bottas, you're seeing that correct. Valtteri Bottas, 14th for Mercedes today. On pace, it wasn't brilliant, but several mistakes lapped by his teammate. Yeah, not one of his best performances. Kimi Räikkönen started so strongly all the way up in P8, finished today's race in P15. George Russell, the only other driver to finish the race, in 16th place. Magnussen, Grosjean, Latifi and Giovinazzi all failed to finish. Magnussen, however, was classified as 3 laps behind as he DNF'd so close to the end. Right, let's move on to race run. What do we call it? A race debrief, cool down room? I don't know. Let's talk about the race. An absolute classic. I love this one. Start to finish drama, and for the first time in goodness me, maybe a couple of seasons, 4 different teams fighting for the victory. Ridiculous. Not even on a street circuit. No safety cars. Loved it. Turkey, I want more. I want to go back in the future. I wasn't quite looking forward to Istanbul quite as much as I was for the likes of Imola, Portimao, but Turkey, it's left an impression on me. I'm sure it's left an impression for a lot of you boys and girls. But I think it's only right for today's Grand Prix, because of just the sheer carnage throughout the race, to start with P1, our new champion, our current champion, our 7-time Formula 1 world champion, and then work our way through the order one by one, unravelling how well their races went. Maybe we'll do team by team as we get a little bit later on. But I really want to start with Lewis Hamilton. I really want to start with Mercedes. What a drive. What a comeback. It was looking in the mud, in the bin for so long this weekend. Practice wasn't looking good for Mercedes. Verstappen top in 1, 2 and 3. But we're so used to Formula 1. Mercedes still pulling it out of the bag. And they didn't yesterday. 6th and 9th. The start of the Grand Prix, both of them had great starts, but contact with Ricciardo, Ocon and Hamilton left Ocon facing the wrong way, Bottas in a spin, and that was Valtteri's day pretty much over from there. Hamilton had a couple of wide moments in those opening laps, but the comeback drive from there on out, practically faultless. And for so long in this Grand Prix, at one stage, he was a whole pit stop behind the race leaders. He did a one-stop, made those tyres last right the way through to the end. No mistakes, a great clinical move on Sergio Perez when it was needed to be done, just as Lance Stroll was making his second pit stop that ultimately left Stroll completely out of the running for a podium in this weekend's race. But from there, Hamilton able to dominate, 31 seconds ahead he was at the checkered flag. Utterly bonkers when you consider that he was a pit stop behind halfway through the Grand Prix. There was a slight threat of rain, which we kind of wondered if that would play a part in maybe Mercedes bringing in Hamilton for a safety stop at the end of the race. But what I absolutely loved was Lewis's mentality right at the end of that race, using his experience from Formula One, but not just experience in the last couple of seasons. On the post-race interviews, he made it very clear he didn't do his final stop because he remembered 2007. I know quite a few of you didn't watch F1 back in 2007, but in the final or the second to last race of the season, Hamilton could have been champion, the first ever, technically second if you count Farina, the second ever rookie world champion. He binned it into the pit lane, went too wide into the gravel on slightly damp conditions, retired from the Grand Prix, lost out on the championship at the next round by 1 point. And that was in his mind. All these years later, he remembered he lost a world championship because of that. And yes, the championship wasn't really on the line, but I just really appreciated that Hamilton knew he wanted to make sure this was in the bag, as secure as possible, no risks. And we saw Bottas, Russell make contact with the wall on the pit entry. And like we have said for so long now, Hamilton, a different league, a class of his own, pure genius behind the wheel of that Mercedes. And as I will always say, Hamilton, the team, so consistent. How many years have Red Bull said next year will be our year? Ferrari got close, and look how that's crumbled this season. Mercedes have constantly been the team to beat, continue to innovate. Hamilton, he's on a streak of championships. He's on a streak of wins, podiums. But I think even more impressively, that streak of points is proof that even through carnage races like today, like 2019 Germany, through all that carnage, when he was in the wall, still managing to recover, get back in the points, and that consistency, paying dividends, being able to pull out those laps of the gods when needed, is why he's 7 times world champion. It's going to take a while to sink in. It's thoroughly deserved, and I'm sure he will, after his comments on the podium at the end, saying he's only getting started. A couple more seasons at least would be awesome to see. I think Hamilton is on his way to 8 next season, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Hamilton flawless today, and so really was the man in P2, Sergio Perez. What I loved about this race was that not only the racing points were 1-2 for almost half of the Grand Prix, but the fact that the only constant from lights out to checkered flag was Sergio Perez throughout, was in that bubble, in that fight for the race victory. Tell me that even last weekend, 12 months ago, I would have thought you were absolutely balmy. We've seen some carnage this year, but on pure pace, in this Grand Prix, Checo Perez fighting for the lead is fantastic, is brilliant, and I loved every second of it. Knowing that if Hamilton made a safety stop, it was still a little bit on edge. If there was any kind of mistake, any kind of mishap, Perez was going to take that lead, was awesome. That little ding-dong at the end with the 2 Ferraris proved how much he wanted it. Yes, it was a slight mistake from Leclerc, but the consistency of that boy, get him a seat next season. Get him a seat now. Thoroughly deserves it. Magical drive today. The 2 Ferraris, very different stories to the likes of Perez, the likes of Verstappen. Ferraris came from nowhere. 11th and 12th on the grid. A fantastic start from Vettel all the way up to 3rd. Held his own in front of Verstappen, in front of Hamilton, making the tyres work. He fell back a little bit, and actually fell back behind Leclerc, and Charles had an okay start. I think he moved backwards a little bit, but kept out of trouble, kept his nose clean. Charles was the guinea pig in this race, and that's something we're not used to saying with Ferrari in 2020. Both times Leclerc stopped, he was the first to make that decision, aka he went onto the inters first and then made the first strategy call to do a second inter stop a little bit later on. Both of them inch perfect. Was able to work through the traffic so easily. Got a couple of cheeky undercuts for good measure. Passed Vettel. Passed Perez on the final lap. Second place from 12th would have been ridiculous. But a lock-up into the final chicane. Let Perez through. Let Vettel through. A great drive from Leclerc. And seeing Sebastian Vettel fighting within that group for the podium throughout the race was just this real nice nostalgia kick, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And seeing him just past Leclerc right at the end really did hit you in the feels. The year he's had with Ferrari to finally get that podium this season was generally just lovely to see. And as a result, Ferrari well and truly back in the hunt in the constructors' standings. Someone we didn't see too much of today was Carlos Sainz, and somehow, just like the majority of 2019, has ended up 5th place. 5th place, and I don't think we saw him until that final little battle with Vettel, with Perez, with Leclerc going over the line for that podium position. And isn't that mad? That a guy who was outside the top 10 in those opening stages got a grid penalty before the start of the Grand Prix. He almost got on the podium, and I don't think we saw him more than twice on track. But what he did do was keep his nose clean, and in races like this, avoiding spins, avoiding lockups, silly little moments, really was going to pay dividends. And for guys like Vettel, Leclerc, Sainz, Norris as well, all of them just being able to keep going, keep plugging away, ultimately all of them coming away with points. I might as well touch on Norris as well with Sainz, because Lando too, we didn't really get to see a lot of him, which was a huge shame because McLaren in the race had some really strong pace. Norris actually setting the fastest lap on the final lap, but even up to that, maybe 4 or 5 laps leading up to the end of the race, was setting the fastest lap. And on a weekend where both drivers had grid penalties, Renault, both of them out qualifying them, Racing Point, pole position and third, to come away with 15 points is awesome from McLaren. And that fight for third in the constructors, though probably yesterday they were going to be quite annoyed heading into this race. What a recovery drive, especially Sainz, 5th place, almost a podium, and Norris as well, getting caught up in that traffic early on. Contact with Russell, a little bit cheeky, I'll allow it, but a little bit cheeky, borderline, a little bit too cheeky. 8th place, fastest lap, 15 points. Great job, McLaren. Splitting the 2 McLarens with the 2 Red Bull cars. Now, a mixed bag is that's the best way I feel to describe Red Bull today, because both drivers showed moments of genius, moments of brilliance. They showed the pace, and I do believe overall today that Red Bull car was the best car on the grid. Both of them had opportunities and the pace to win this Grand Prix. Verstappen carving his way through the field in the early stages after a terrible getaway, really bogging down, couldn't quite find first gear, an absolute nightmare. But his recovery, like we're so used to, was awesome. Getting past Checo Perez, a little bit too greedy, little bit too eager, just that little bit of patience would have done in dividends. Runs it slightly wide after trying to get out of the spray, loses it on the straight, drops all the way down the field, has to do an extra stop. Nightmare from there on out. Several spins spun by Kimi Räikkönen, spun into the chicane, and it's something we're not really used to with Max Verstappen in wet conditions. And I kind of feel a little bit harsh critiquing him after the incredible season he's had this year. This is the first race he's finished a Grand Prix and not been on the podium. And I just wonder, maybe yesterday, getting 2nd place, just missing out on pole. Mercedes nowhere in this fight. All year long, Verstappen's been on his own. 3rd place, not fighting the Mercs, not fighting the guys behind. Obviously, there's been slight variations on that from weekend to weekend. Of course, he would have got second last time out in Imola, if not for that mechanical failure. But he's been, on the whole, quite lonely in 2020. Maybe, knowing this was his opportunity for a win, seeing it slip through his fingers, just kind of give him that little bit more of an urge, a little bit more fire, and just those mistakes were happening more and more, and it just completely unravelled. More points than Bottas actually means he gets closer to second in the standings, but I do feel Verstappen will be annoyed at today's performance. Certainly, I said it with Russell last weekend, Russell crashing under the safety car. You got to learn from it, you got to spin it into a positive, and I think Max can do that today, because on pace, without those mistakes, I think he could have easily had the victory today, and those mistakes, you've got to use that. You've got to use that experience, put it in your arsenal, and get better in the future. And that's certainly something we have seen so many times in Verstappen's career, and I'm sure this time will be no different. On the other side of the garage, Alex Albon, like Verstappen, I said it earlier, just a mixed bag of a Grand Prix. A driver under pressure, a driver who's coming off the back of two terrible Grand Prix, and he could have won today. He could have won. He was in a position right behind the two Racing Point cars, clearly quicker, has the better car. Verstappen had made his mistake. Hamilton at this stage seemed to be nowhere, stuck behind Vettel. If Albon had got past those two Racing Point cars, sailed off into the distance, I think we could be looking at his first ever Formula 1 victory. Instead, he had that spin, one spin, and this is where I find it so frustrating with Red Bull today, because it was one spin that cost him so much. And there were other drivers that made more than one mistake. Hamilton struggling with his brakes early on, running deep a couple of times into the first corner and the chicane, but was able to learn, recover. Albon made the one mistake, and it's so frustrating that it was so costly, but that was a huge moment. That was a pivotal moment, I believe, in his Formula 1 career. If he doesn't make that mistake, I think he's staying. But with Perez in second place after a dominant second place performance, I don't know. We spoke about it, didn't we, in the week on Transfer Talk. Today's result, behind Verstappen, on paper it doesn't look dreadful, just one behind his teammates. But he needs to be there when Verstappen's making mistakes. So the fact that Verstappen has made mistakes and is still in front of Albon isn't a fantastic look. I do worry about Red Bull today, and yeah, a mixed bag, because the pace was there. Both drivers had opportunities to win, but ultimately 6th and 7th, there's not really a lot they're fighting for in terms of the constructors, but it's going to be a frustrating day for the team. Lance Stroll, 9th place. Poor guy. Poor guy. Faultless yesterday. Faultless. Pole position, utterly deserved. League of his own. Today, led the majority of the Grand Prix, and ultimately his undoing is a poor strategy call. In hindsight, they shouldn't have done it. But at the time, Leclerc was flying on those new inters, and if they'd have called him in 2, 3, 1 lap even maybe, before, things could have been hunky-dory, things could have been rosy, they could have got up at the temperature. But allowing that extra lap meant the track was able to dry up that little bit more. Stroll couldn't get the tyres up to temperature, ultimately dropping behind the likes of Norris. Sainz, the two Red Bulls, had no chance of defending. And it was just a really sorry sight to see after he'd been so good all race long. Didn't put a foot wrong, but that's sometimes how it goes. It's a good bounce back. Well, it's a fantastic bounce back to form for Stroll. And I think, yes, tonight, he's going to be gutted. He was on pole. He was leading the Grand Prix, and he's come away with 2 points. But actually, he had the pace for a podium today. He had the pace potentially to win the Grand Prix. That's going to give him a lot of confidence. And for a driver who's lacking so much recently, that's going to be a big benefit into the final 3 races. Renault had a quiet-ish day. Ricciardo and Ocon, brilliant starts. Both of them challenging for podiums into the first corner. Ocon, I feel, is one of the most unluckiest drivers. Contact with Ricciardo. Ricciardo had nowhere to go. Hamilton on the inside. Ocon could have left a little bit more space, but by the time he's already turned in, his mirrors aren't going to see Hamilton. He's got no idea Hamilton's there. If he runs too wide, he's going to massively risk losing out on positions. I think that's a racing incident. That's what the stewards gave. Further contact with Bottas later on in lap 1 gave Ocon a puncture, and the fight back actually to be 11 seconds behind Ricciardo at the checkered flag. A really good drive, but it's a day points were available to Renault. But then I guess when you look at where they were in practice, when you look at Ricciardo's pace, Ricciardo made no mistakes today. Just the pace just wasn't there in that Renault car. Lucky to get a point. And at the same time, that point, we all know how close it's been in that fight for best of the rest this year. And that 1 point could make a massive difference. Time is of the essence. So what I will do is just quickly wrap up these final few drivers, and then we'll move on to driver of the day and race rating. AlphaTauri, 12th and 13th. A quiet day. Gasly starting from the back after a bizarre situation where the team decided to take apart his car. They got permission from the FIA to take apart his car, change some power unit structures, and then put it back together. Well, they took apart the car, then decided they didn't want to change anything. Put it back together. The FIA said, well, how are we supposed to inspect that? All got messy, resulting in a massive grid penalty, starting technically 19th because George Russell managed to get more penalties. Goodness me, it was like the McLaren Honda days where they had 60 apiece. Anyways, comeback drive was quite strong from Pierre Gasly, finishing just behind Kvyat. Gasly also did an extra pit stop. AlphaTauri, though, they've been in great form recently. I think they will be frustrated to not pick up points today. Valtteri Bottas. Wasn't great is an understatement. Probably the worst drive of his career. And I don't really blame him. He was driving to hold on to this title, and to lose out on lap 1 after an awesome start, to then have a Renault flying in front of you, he's got to get out the way, spins, contact with Ocon later on, and from there it just got worse and worse and worse. Several spins throughout the Grand Prix, held up Hamilton with the blue flag. It was a nightmare for Valtteri Bottas. 14th place, no points, championship over, Verstappen's closer. I'm sure in these remaining 3 races, Mercedes will make sure that he does secure that second place, but not a great one from Valtteri. Finished in front of Raikkonen. Raikkonen qualified in front of him, but Kimi, again, a driver making a lot of mistakes today. I think the Alfa Romeo car with Giovinazzi, he was flying into the wall before the race had even started, before we got to the formation lap on his way to the grid. It just didn't seem very planted or very grippy compared to those other cars out there. And I think, though yesterday they did great in qualifying with the tyres, in the race today, I just think something was missing with the Alfa Romeo car today. 15th, not the greatest from Raikkonen, but hey, I think that Alfa Romeo at times has been the worst car this season. So the fact they got both cars into Q3, massive bonus yesterday. So they can't be too disappointed with the weekend overall. And your final finisher, George Russell, 16th. Williams tried a gamble with both cars, starting in the pit lane, starting on the inters. It didn't pay off. Russell had a little ding-dong with Norris that we mentioned earlier. Apart from that, a quiet race, but both Russell and Magnussen holding on at one stage, just hovering around the edges of the points. But when he did have to make his stop, never really came back into play anywhere near the points at the checkered flag. Your 4 non-finishers, Magnussen, Grosjean, Latifi and Giovinazzi. Latifi, like Russell, tried something different at the start, but a few more spins than he would have wanted put him all the way out. Contact with Grosjean put both of them out. K-Mag had, a strong race with Russell just holding on to some points, but a terrible pit stop, a loose wheel. Not the greatest day from Haas. Ultimately retiring with 3 laps to go. Before we jump into driver of the day, then let's take a quick look at your drivers and constructors standings. And if I haven't mentioned it already, we've got a world champion of 2020, Lewis Hamilton, 307 points, unbeatable by any other driver. Valtteri Bottas in second place is closer to 6th place Daniel Ricciardo than he is to Lewis Hamilton's tally. Bottas being closed down by Verstappen, just 27 points between the two of them. First podium of the season put Sergio Perez P4 in front of Leclerc and Ricciardo. It's then so close in the battle for 7th. Sainz ahead of Norris, ahead of Albon, and Pierre Gasly rounds out your top 10. This weekend's poleman Lance Stroll is P11, scoring a couple of points for the first time since Monza. Ocon down in P12, being hunted down by podium sitter this weekend Sebastian Vettel, scoring almost half of his points this season in today's race alone. Really paints how terrible this year has been for Seb. Kvyat is 14th, Hulkenberg, our super sub, is 15th. 4 points each for both Alfa Romeo drivers, 2 for Grosjean, 1 for Magnussen, and nil points for Latifi and Russell. And your Constructors' Championship, last time out at Imola, Mercedes were crowned champions. Red Bull can secure P2 next time out at the Bahrain Grand Prix. Then it's all hands on deck in the fight for best of the rest. Racing Point ahead of McLaren, ahead of Renault, ahead of Ferrari. But all 3 teams split by 24 points. This is going to be a spicy battle to end out the season. AlphaTauri a bit on their own now in 7th place on 89 points. Alfa Romeo on 8, Haas on 3, and Williams the only team in 2020 yet to score. And before I leave you, driver of the day and race rating. Driver of the day is a difficult one. Actually, I think this is the hardest one all season long. Yesterday, I gave it to Lance Stroll, his first ever pole position in Formula 1. In today's race, I think I'm going to give it to Perez. I mentioned earlier, the only driver, well, he didn't make a mistake for starters, but the only driver to consistently be fighting for the lead throughout the race, start to finish, in a Racing Point car. Awesome stuff from Checo today. Seb Vettel, my P2, but you could easily throw in the likes of Sainz, Leclerc, and my F1E driver of the weekend. You could also throw him in as well, Lewis Hamilton. It had to be. What a race today. Yesterday was disappointing. 7 world titles. History was made. And you know what? It was quite emotional. It really was. And to go along with an emotional Grand Prix is the race rating. And for the second time, ladies and gentlemen, the second time in 2020, the third time in channel history, we are giving the 2020 Turkish Grand Prix a 10 out of 10. A very different style of 10 out of 10 that we've given before. No safety cars today. No crashes. No dramas. Just pure racing. I loved it. Not knowing who was going to win, from lights to checkered flag, a bit of rain in the air, changing conditions. I thought it was awesome. I really did. A mixed up podium as well, a 7-time champion. I'd love to know your thoughts, driver of the day and race rating, in the comment section down below. And I'll leave that there. It's been a long one, and we've even rushed it a little bit more than I wanted, but hey, it was a cracker. It's races like this which make you realise why you're a Formula 1 fan. But as always, if you are new, feel free to subscribe. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time for the triple header Bahrain, the Sakir Grand Prix, and our season finale in Abu Dhabi on the 15th of December. So hopefully you will join me for the ride. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.